What's up, everybody? I just found the most definitive evidence for the cyclical annihilation of Earth that I've ever shown you guys. This isn't just a buried forest, it is several buried forests on top of each other. Now, I know this is old hat for you guys that have been around for years, but I haven't talked about this in a while, so there are a lot of new people that haven't heard any of this. So let me get you guys caught up to speed here. This is actually the subject that got me into making videos. There's buried cities all around the world showing evidence of something major happening in their past. The simplest explanation, Occam's razor and all of that, is that there's been a major flood. This is the Arch of Septimus Severus in Rome in the 1600s. And you can see that the ground level is about belly high for the carvings in the reliefs there. Well, this is that same arch today after being excavated. So the ground level was obviously lower when they built it back in ancient times. I mean, that's all ornate work. They didn't purposely bury that as part of the foundation. But by the 1600s, the ground level was up to where the white line is. Now, there is an entire buried city underneath modern Rome. Actually, cities on top of each other, because at some places this goes down like 6 stories. This is a list of excavated sites that you can go see as a tourist there. And about every 2 weeks in my news feed, I get a new archaeological discovery by a construction crew in Rome. Anytime you dig a hole in Rome, you find something new. Here's an excavation that's been going on for years of houses from the upper crust of society. And this structure is known as Nero's Circus. Circus just meaning circle, and it is a racetrack for chariot racing. This is the original mega sports complex. And this whole sports stadium can be found right here at St. Peter's Square in the Pope's home. The only reason nobody ever sees it is because it's directly under the Vatican. So there's no question at all that the ancient city of Rome has been buried since ancient times. And this stands true for cities all around the world. Underneath Paris, France, is the ancient city of Lutetia, I believe is pronounced, but I sometimes call it Lutetia. And underneath Notre Dame Cathedral is an ancient temple dedicated to Jupiter. We know these cities are under modern cities, so the question is, why are they buried? Well, my original pontification is this, and sorry, I couldn't help myself with the pun there. Get it? Pontificate, pontiff, pope. Even the internet's pushing me into that pun, a static way of delivering information. Didn't have to call me pompous, though. Okay, but my original guess on why all of these cities are buried is that every major city in the world is on a major river. Rivers are the original superhighways, and you gotta have water to live. Still to this day, most of the major cities are along major waterways. The Tiber River starts way up in the Apennine Mountains and flows down to Rome, and what happens next isn't rocket science. A major flood comes, and like I was just talking about in a recent video, all of the topsoil gets washed away. Where does it go? Down to the lower lying areas, which in this case is Rome, and voila, you've got a buried city. Same thing goes for Paris. You've got the Seine and other major rivers flowing through there. A flood came through and deposited all of the silt from upstream, and now you've got the buried city of Lutetia. Now, this is all very sound logic for why things are buried, but what about historical accounts? Well, it took me a couple of years, but yep, I found that too. I've talked about this book before, and it seems like they took one big catastrophe that was all across the Mediterranean and spread it out over 1,000 years. Because you'll have an earthquake in one area, and then 100 years later, right next door will be a tsunami, and then 100 years after that, right next door will be another tsunami. It seems more plausible that these all happened at the same time. But they date the annihilation of Rome in this book to 588 AD. And for those of you that know about the 536 AD complete reset, that number of 536 AD is just agreed upon by modern historians. So with them dating this at 588, then it's definitely that event. And not to make it too confusing for people new to this, but I think the 536 AD and 1300s catastrophes are the same event. And here's just one example of why. God sent several judgments on them, and this is talking about Italy, first by a rain which fell in the months of September and October incessantly for many days together, and raised such floods in all rivers and lakes of Italy as overflowed and drowned an infinite number of people and cattle. Coincidentally, the exact same thing, months of incessant rain, happened in England in the 1300s. They say in summer and autumn, so August, September, October, and 800 years before in Italy, same thing in September and October. That's quite the coincidence that these both happened at the same time of year, right down the road from each other, 800 years apart. Could have been, and I think most likely was, the exact same weather system. Anyway, incessant rains and the river Tiber swelled so high that all the fields which were not hilly and mountainous were overflowed. So as all apprehended a second deluge, as in like Noah's flood, the deluge, especially in Rome, where the Tiber swelled so high that in some places it reached to, and in others overflowed the city's high walls. Now, this is the actual city walls that they are talking about. So the water was up above that. Just imagine how widespread this would have been. It overflowed the city's high walls, and the water rushed in with such fury that it spoiled and defaced the greatest part of the buildings that were near the river. When the flood ceased, the fields were so soft and covered with slime and mud that they could no longer be tilled nor sown, hence a general famine. The flood not only demolished many stately buildings and ancient monuments, but got into the church granaries and carried away many thousands measures of wheat. You can see the difference in priorities here because they're worried about the food being gone, where today people would just be worried about the buildings and how many billions it would cost to rebuild it. But there you have it in plain black and white, a first-hand account saying that this is what happened to the ancient city of Rome. Now, I'm sure that Alaric really did sack the city at some point, but that's not what ended it. After getting sacked, you pay a ransom and a tribute to the conquerors. After getting buried in 20 feet of mud, it sits there until somebody digs it out and turns it into a modern amusement park. After the flood, the river brought down innumerable multitudes of serpents, and among them a monstrous great one as big as a great beam, all which swimming down the river into the sea were there choked, and their carcasses being cast on the shore, rotted, by whose stench the slime and mud and excessive moisture, the air was so corrupted that a most desolating and guinery plague ensued all over Italy, Spain, and France. You guys know how nasty that would be, just millions and millions of reptiles and snakes out baking in the sun. So all of the water is contaminated everywhere. Then they say where it was most favorable, 2/3 of the people didn't make it. That's where things were better, but it was worse in Rome. Here's a model of ancient Rome, and you've got Nero Circus down here close to the water, so that's a lower lying area, which is obviously covered in now, and the Vatican sits on top. They say 2/3 were gone in the most favorable of areas, so at least 7/8 of this city didn't weather the storm. So even areas that weren't directly buried, you'd still have entire neighborhoods that were completely empty after this. And this would be no different than what everybody says about a modern SHTF situation. I mean, I've got written accounts where they say you don't travel alone because people will grab you and eat you. And even more graphic accounts that I'm not going to bring up. You can look at paintings from 300 years ago and see how it's set ever since. Going back to a map, if it was the same weather system, say an eruption of an Icelandic volcano that flooded out England and Italy, well, what do you got right in the middle of that? Paris, which is on top of the ancient flooded city of Lutetia. One incessant weather pattern dumping months worth of rain accounts for everything we find here. That's just a theory, of course, but let's look at this on an American scale. From Italy up to England is about 1,000 miles. So that's roughly from about Miami to St. Louis. That's actually not a very big storm system at all. Hurricane Idalia is just now reaching Illinois from the Gulf Coast. So just imagine what would happen if that stalled for 2 or 3 months over that area. Well, you'd have all kinds of American cities looking like this if they're lucky, and just completely buried if not. Now, in the bigger picture of things, these events and cycles that we've discussed so far are the minor ones. These are city-ending events that might happen around every 500,000 years, maybe. But then every maybe 5 to 10,000 years, you have the world age-ending events. Most people just know this as the Great Flood. All kinds of cultures have a story of this that is roughly the same. You know, Noah's flood, Utnapishtim, Atrahasis. They were all told by a god to build an ark. The Greeks say that Deucalion was the sole survivor of the flood, but I can't remember if he built a boat or not. Before this flood, they say that Phaethon, the son of the sun god, fell down to earth and scorched the earth. So first by fire, then by flood. The Aztecs say we're in the age of the fifth sun, and the last two world ages were fire and then a flood. I don't put much stock in rigid timelines, but I would say that the Great Flood was probably 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and it was probably a few thousand years before that when something fell out of the sky and scorched the earth. But these are the world age-ending events where you have very few survivors. We've got the, quote, mythological evidence of these things happening. Let's look at the geological evidence of these happening. This is a mine in Kentucky, and this is the most amazing find ever, really. I may not sound that excited about it, but I've been at it for about 7 hours here on this video. I've taken Ruckus on 2 W's, and he freaked out on this garage sale sign in his territory. But this is update the textbook level amazing. I'm going to read you guys what it says about it. Just so you know, the first 3 pictures are the only actual pictures of the mine, but I'll probably throw in some others. So check this out. Spectacular fossil forests have been found in the coal mines of Illinois by a US-UK team of researchers. The group reported 1 discovery last year, but has since identified a further 5 examples. The ancient vegetation, now turned to rock, is visible in the ceilings of mines covering thousands of hectares. Quote, "These are the largest fossil forests found anywhere in the world at any point in geological time. It is quite extraordinary to find a fossil landscape over such a vast area, an area the size of the British city of Bristol. The forests grew just a few million years apart, some 300 million years ago, conjecture, and are now stacked one on top of another. It appears the ancient land experienced repeated periods of subsidence and flooding, which buried the forest in a vertical sequence. The 6 forests straddle a period in Earth's history, blah, blah, million years ago." So they just said 6 forests vertically. So the forest grows X amount of years and then gets buried. And then a new forest grows X amount of years and then gets buried 6 times. Quote, "You can actually see upright tree stumps that are pointed vertically up above your head with the roots coming down." So I'm not sure if they even know if there's whole complete standing trees that are buried. If that's the case, I mean, you know, trees are 80 to 200 feet tall, and who knows how tall back at that time. And they say we found 30-meter long trees that had fallen with their crowns perfectly preserved. So the leaves weren't above the surface long enough to decompose. They were just instantly buried. I did some digging to see if I could find the tallest vertical tree ever discovered. And in 1842, Nova Scotia, a man claims to have found a 40-foot standing tree. But since nobody else has found anything near that tall, they say that he may be estimating the overall height of a tree off of a stump. But I think the majority of what people find is like this. The top of the tree gets snapped off. This is in Kentucky as well, where the 6 forests are stacked on top of each other, and we'll look at an elevation map in a minute, but you can see the stump there. And my take on this is all of the muck flowed in very quickly and buried this whole area here, and then the rushing water up above snaps the tree off. This is sandstone, a sedimentary stone, which means that at one time it wasn't stone. It's hardened into that. So that's a pretty awesome example of these destructions that have taken place. Now, looking at this on a map, these 6 vertical forests are right here in Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky. Well, this is a choke point on a scale that very few people even consider, but it's the lowlands, Mississippi Valley, wedged in between the Appalachians and the Rocky Mountains. Now, they say that this all happened over millions and millions of years. This could have been just 5,000-year intervals. We'll talk about the driving force behind this much energy in a minute. But that choke point is where all of the organic matter for millions and millions of square miles would get scrubbed off of the surface and deposited. And of course, the mountain ranges themselves have changed over time. There are a lot of old mythologies saying that mountain ranges spring up relatively overnight. Now, let's say you're somewhere like the Front Range right here, or this could even be Arizona or something on the other side. If you're in a place that still has good drainage downhill, you might find something like this. You have that bottom coal seam of, 4 or 5 inches, because all of the organic matter is, in the water like a thick soup, but there's still somewhere for it to go downhill, so it only leaves 3 or 4 inches of the organic matter. Now, for thousands and thousands of miles around, it's just a barren wasteland, so the wind could blow in all of this sand and everything that makes up this layer, and then it happened again, only there wasn't as much organic matter to deposit. And then once again, you get all of the sand, and they call it loess, very fine dust particles that build up on top of that. But then in places like the Mississippi Delta, where you have an entire continent draining down to, right now there's 40 feet of soil there. If everything got washed down from the plains up above, then you'd probably end up with 80 feet of soil, which is equivalent to the thickest coal seams that we know of, like in Wyoming. But Wyoming is at a very high elevation, so all of that was probably deposited before the Rocky Mountain uplift. Oh yeah, and this is a cool view of it, because you have the organic matter coal deposits and then an entire mountain of sandstone on top of it. So what could possibly cause all of this? Well, I think the most likely candidate is a comet impact, and I think they downplay the frequency of these. And before anybody says, "Nuh-uh, there's a firmament, it's an impenetrable dome right above our heads," see this video that I made. What the ancients were referring to as a firmament is what we would call the edge of space, the boundary between the physical and ethereal worlds. And trust me, the ancients knew that rocks fell down from the sky and screwed up all kinds of stuff. The Chicxulub crater here is hundreds of miles across, and there's these craters all around the world. I don't think I have to explain the giant wave that would occur here, but this also explains stories like Phaethon and the god from heaven that fell down and scorched the earth. If one of these streaked overhead, burning hotter than the sun, 5 miles away from you, it's going to scorch everything around. And yeah, I know that, let's see, what won the internet popularity contest? Liquefaction and plasma blasts. Those get the most clicks, so they must be true, right? I'm not going to start in explaining all this late in a video, but the evidence we see doesn't line up with what happens in those scenarios. And actually, I think plate tectonic theory may be wrong. It's not that the continents are constantly moving to new areas. It's that the continents are resettling after being disturbed by a huge impact. Anyway, this isn't a video about what caused these things. You can't cover everything in a 15-20 minute video. This is a video about the evidence that shows something major has happened, and we have 6 forests on top of each other, buried way down under the ground. So something, whatever it may be, has happened repeatedly and for a long, long time. And something that big that could bury 6 forests on top of each other, those are world age ending events. In our current world age, we have had multiple smaller scale events that have buried cities. And just a word to the wise, if you're new to this, almost, I'd say 95% of everything on the internet right now under the header of mud flood is just incorrect. Sorry. So if you're going to go down that rabbit hole, put on your boots, because it's going to get thick quick. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.